So when you think Hyundai, what one word comes to mind? To me, it's always been value, but then a little over a year ago, they updated the Genesis, they hired the folks in Hethel to make the car, well, go around corners. But then there's the biggest selling Hyundai they have, and that's the Elantra. So the question now is, has any of that Anthony Cohen Bruce Chapman learning made its way down the line? Okay, you guys need to belt in and pay attention because we have a lot to cover. You see, way back in the old days of the previous generation Elantra, things were very simple because there was only one engine on offer. Now things are more complicated because there are two engines on offer. Let's start with the one we are not driving today, at least not driving yet. We will come back to it at some point. It is the 1.4-liter four-cylinder direct-injected gas turbo engine. That puts out 128 horsepower, which comes in at 5,500 RPM and 156 pound-feet of torque. 1.4 liter, 156 pound-feet of torque, which comes in at a stupidly low 1,400 RPM, stays flat all the way to 3,700 RPM. Now, let's put that one aside and let's talk about the one we are driving today. That is the 2-liter four-cylinder engine. Now, this one, yes, it makes some power. It's got 147 horsepower, which comes in at 6,200 RPM, a relatively high engine speed, and it's got 132 pound-feet of torque, which comes in at 4,500 RPM. So it's somewhat opposite of that 1.4 turbo. So the smaller engine is actually the one that is like the big engine choice, if you follow me here. And really what they're trying to do is that smaller engine is the Elantra Eco. So if you're following along in the Eco in the Sonata world, basically what that means is the transmissions change as well. So this 2-liter can be had with a 6-speed manual, but only in the basic model, not the fancy one we have here, or a 6-speed automatic. But then if you move over to that 1.4 turbo, that gets a 7-speed dual clutch. So the other automatic that's in this engine, that's a torque converter, to be very clear. So the 7-speed, that's a dual clutch, and we've driven that in that Hyundai Sonata Eco. Go back to that episode, check it out. Definitely like that engine a lot. Now there's something else going on here. This one, and we covered this in the tech review episode of this car, this is an Atkinson Cycle in the 2-liter model. We covered the differences between Auto and Atkinson Cycle, so make sure you go back to that episode to check it out. But now, how does all this 2-liter and Atkinson Cycle in a car that's not a hybrid translate to pulling power out on the road? Now, before we dive into this like we normally do, I just gotta say this. This is the first time I'm driving a car that is an Atkinson Cycle engine that is not a hybrid. So now we got that out of the way, let's put our foot into it. So we're going up a little hill here. I am foot to the floor, and there is a surprising amount of power. Like, I didn't expect this thing to pull. Now, is it a Porsche 911 Turbo S? Absolutely not. But it actually has a little bit more power, at least pulling power, than the last Elantra. Now, put aside the basic setup here, because what is it, 128 pound-feet of torque? That's not really a lot. There is a drive mode system here, and this really affects three things. There's the steering mapping, there's the throttle mapping, and then there's the transmission mapping. So right now I'm in the basic mode. Let's get the boring mode out of the way. Let's go into Eco. Put our foot into Eco. Definitely takes a little bit longer. It doesn't rev as high. Like the shift points actually are a little bit lower than in the regular mode. So it actually will shift at a lower engine speed when you're in Eco mode. So there is some effect on the transmission mapping, but if I'm being honest, I don't really see a big difference between regular and Eco on the steering. Now let's move to the sport mode, the one you and I want. Okay, so sport mode, again, we're going up the hill. Let's put our foot into it. It downshifts a bit faster, so once again, this transmission mapping definitely changes. But if I'm being honest, I don't really feel a huge difference in the throttle mapping. And I've been driving this thing for a couple hours now, and I really haven't seen that much of a difference between the regular and the sport mode and this drive mode select thing. I definitely see a difference in the Eco to sport, or eco to regular, but not from sport to regular. But the drive mode also makes changes to the steering, and this is where you do notice some changes. So we're going around a bit of a sweeper here in an Elantra, and it doesn't take as much driver input to go around that arc of the turn. So let's try it again here, put our foot into it. I will say, even with the sportier version of the steering, it's still a little light. But now I'm starting to veer off into driving dynamics when we're supposed to focus on pulling power. So with that, let's try something completely different. So in the tech review film of this car, we spent some time talking about various bits as it relates to the construction of the vehicle, the materials of construction, and the fact that this car was in dire need of a revised rear suspension. But the thing we didn't cover is a riddle. What does this Elantra have in common with a Lotus, an Aston Martin, and the new Cadillac CT6? If you were to say adhesives in the construction of the vehicle, you would be correct. So most race cars or fancy cars we just talked about are now using more adhesives and rivets to connect the structure parts of the vehicle in order to make the vehicle lighter and stronger simultaneously. Now, why does someone want to do that, go through all that trouble of gluing, effectively that's what adhesives are, gluing a car together? Well, if you make a car lighter, you can affect very positively your driving dynamics. So how does that affect this vehicle now combined with revised rear suspension? Oh, I forgot to tell you guys, there's also some changes to the front suspension. Let's start there. So we talked about the steering in the previous bit. One of the things that changes up there is it's still a McPherson strut that's up there, but they changed the subframe. So the subframe itself is actually, it's a bit of a smaller unit in an H pattern, so it's a little bit lighter, but still a little bit stronger. Put aside that, let's get to the most important bit, and that is that rear suspension where the dampers literally go from here to like here. Now we've got some nice roads outside of Imperial Beach, San Diego here. The last Elantra, I don't think anybody would mix that up with a Mazda 3 in terms of driving dynamics. Like when people would come up to me and ask me, hey, which compact car do you think I should buy? I, of course, say a Mazda 3, but if they wanted value, I went here, because it's like a spectrum kind of thing. The Mazda was always up here in driving dynamics, and this was always kind of down here. It doesn't mean this was bad, it just, this was more value. You got stuff like heated rear seats instead of driving dynamics out of a fancy multi-link rear unit. But here, now that we have the outboard larger dampers, I've spent some time driving around roads like this. For example, let's put our foot into it, push a little bit more. Please don't try this at home. And you know what? There's actually some composure there. Like, I'm kind of stunned that there actually is composure there. Now, there's a bit of an asterisk here. Let's really put our foot into it, overdrive the car a little bit, and if you don't give it the time to kind of let it set itself up in terms of where it wants to put the weight, that's when it kind of rolls onto itself back there, even to the point where there's a lot of lean from side to side. So it does a lot better job of composure, but in terms of pitch, squat, dive, and roll, specifically the pitch and the roll, that's where it could use a little bit more work back there. Okay, thus far we haven't discussed the whole point of this car, which is MPG. So this is the 2-liter model, and it does anywhere between 29 and 38 MPG. The average is 33. That 1.4 that will drive, hopefully at some point, brings the average more to 35. Remember, it's got a smaller engine even though it has more torque. Now, that's all really what these cars focus on nowadays is MPG, and everybody's focusing on efficiency of the engine. But you know what? There's also efficiency of the construction method of the vehicle. Well, it seems yet another reason why other car companies should be scared shitless of Hyundai. The seats, specifically the foam that is underneath the leather in this specific car, it's not normal foam, which is derived from oil. which I'd like to point out at the time of this filming, oil, like just a couple of days ago, went down to $27 a barrel. 27. It bounced back up to a whopping 30, but I digress. Anyway, the folks at Hyundai decided they want to make this thing less carbon footprint, not just the MPG, but also in the construction. So you know how you people like to go to Starbucks, the Coffee Bean, and get those like pansy soy drinks that you get and spend like $85 on thinking you're saving money every month? Well, in reality, these seats have something in common with those soy drinks in that the foam is made out of soy oil. Okay, so put aside all the musings of a crazy man that loves cars built in a shed in the southeast of England. I don't know if you guys noticed, but I've seen a lot of these where hipsters habitate, you know, like places like Brooklyn and Echo Park and things like that. So obviously Hyundai's had to make some changes here, and one of them is this car now has Apple CarPlay. If you haven't noticed throughout this episode, I've had my phone connected here, and you could do the usual like CarPlay bits like the messages, which I think, of course, is there's no cell phone coverage out here, so we go back to the main menu. You can go to the maps here. Again, there's probably no connectivity, so it's probably not a great place to demonstrate, which is why you'd probably want to go back to the regular Hyundai screen here, and it actually shows you the navigation maps that are from the UX system from Hyundai, which now there's two ways you can do this. You can actually do the version that is the 7-inch screen that doesn't have the Hyundai navigation, but you can also do the version like this, which is the 8-inch screen, the bigger screen that has the navigation in it for situations like this where you have no connectivity. Now, speaking of connectivity, let's go back to the Apple CarPlay here as we go around some very nice roads here. It's kind of a shame to waste this segment on Apple CarPlay. So we go back here, you can see, voila, Apple CarPlay, right? See, guys, you get it? Now, watch this presto changeo here. Now let's take the phone, put it on the passenger seat. Let's try not to kill ourselves as we do this. Unplug the Apple iPhone. See? Unplugged. We are now back at the Hyundai UX. You can see the Hyundai menu here. Let's go back to the main menu. That shows us the split screen here. And look what else I brought along on our little road trip. An Android phone. So for those of you that hate iOS or just anything in or from Cupertino, we are going to plug this in and watch and see and marvel at us hot swap to Android Auto. Reading USB. Let's see if it does it. Reading USB. And in this process, I turned on the heated seat in 70-degree weather. Oh, look! Android Auto. It's loading. Android Auto! And it's 68 degrees, and I still have my heated seat on. Let's turn that off. So we have just hot swapped between an iOS device and an Android device on backcountry roads of San Diego. And we can do all the Android Auto stuff, like you can go into the music here, and there's different types of connectivity services, obviously Amazon, Google, iHeartRadio, NPR. I'd also like to point out that our fancy app, the MotoManTV app, which you can download for free in Google Play, is the first app outside of these like blessed apps from Google that will work natively with Android Auto. We have a podcast which is in the app, and you will start seeing more podcasts coming. You will be able to stream them in Android Auto native. So I just say you're welcome. So in the tech review episode, we spent a lot of time covering all the bits that are now on this thing. One of my favorites is steering headlights on a Hyundai Elantra, of all things. Well, apparently I forgot to tell you one thing, and that is also something that has been pilfered from its big brother, and that is the active shutters in the front here. You see the grille here, while it's jewelry, it's also drag. So in the Eco model of the Sonata, they have these active shutters, and frankly, it's not just Hyundais that do this. Ford, Chevys, a lot of car companies do this, and the logic is to have their airflow coming in when there's load on the engine to cool the engine more efficiently, but when the car is going at speed, meaning less load, needs less air, it shuts off the air coming in, makes the front end more efficient, and routes the air around the car And that is how the Hyundai design folks, remember our friends down in Irvine, that's how they get this thing to 0.27 coefficient of drag. Okay, so let's go back to the main menu of Android Auto, and frankly, we need to clean up the mess of phones around here. I feel like the interior is littered with telephones. And while we're doing that, I want to point out, this thing is incredibly fancy. Like, I remember back in the day, one year, me and a couple of buddies from Arizona State University went to the Florida Keys for spring break, and we drove a Hyundai Excel, an 86 Hyundai Excel, and fully expected to pick up women. And now fast forward to 2016, and this thing is as fancy as like a Cadillac or a Mercedes. It's got memory seats, the heated seats even in the back, steering headlights, but it also has like blind spot warning, lane keep assist, and then there's a camera up here for pedestrian avoidance. So basically the car will come to a complete stop on its own to avoid hitting a pedestrian, and also facilitates the smart cruise thing. Now, putting aside all the different bits here, I'm confused because I thought I was driving a C segment car, but really, is this a C segment car, or is it now a near luxury car that just happens to come in a more pint-sized form? So in summary, what do we got? Well, between a tech review and now the full first drive review, you and I have covered a lot of stuff. We've covered an Atkinson Cycle engine, all sorts of whiz-bang gizmo apps in there, Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, even steering headlights. The reality is, put all that aside, because the only thing that matters is the rear suspension. By changing the size of the damper from here to here and moving it from the inside to the outside, transforms this car. Now, if I'm being honest, is this a Mazda 3? Absolutely not. But if we go back to that spectrum that we've put the driving dynamics of compact cars on, the Mazda 3 is still very much here. The Focus was kind of like here, but the Elantra used to be the bottom of the barrel here. But now, by making all of those changes there, it goes from here to here. So like 40–45% up that spectrum. Now, let's put all that aside, because in the 2 or so days that I've been driving this thing, there's a question that's kind of burned into my brain here. This one here, this very red car here, this is the limited super duper ultimate model. They actually really call this the ultimate model. It is $27,000 US. That is not an inconsequential amount of money. For that kind of money, you could go up a little bit and get a Mercedes CLA or an Audi A3, go down and get like a Scion. So my question to you is this: would you get a C-Class car like this with everything and then some in it, or would you go a little cheaper and get something more affordable, or would you, at $27,000, would you just throw in more money, go all in, and get a fancy car? So let me know which one of those you would choose, why you would choose it, and more importantly, what do you currently drive? And actually, for good measure, what region of the world you live in. Let me know in the comments below or via our social media, MotoManTV all in word, MotoManTV all in word, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And with that, I want to leave you guys with 2 things. Number 1, make sure you download our fancy new mobile application, which works with this car here. Our app is one of actually the first app besides the Google blessed apps that actually work natively with Android Auto. Test me on this. And number 2, so the folks at Hyundai, when we were talking this morning, they had this super double secret hush meeting, and they showed some details of an upcoming version of this car, the Sport model. What I can share with you, because they said if I share too much, they're gonna like send someone after me and kill me and bury me somewhere in Korea. But anyway, I digress. There is going to be a Sport model with a 1.64 with around 200 horsepower. And what I can't tell you is there's something else about it that is incredibly cool and incredibly exciting, but we will have to come back to you on that. Until then, bis später.